In the summer of 1941, at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, an internal report by the Signal Corps began with a chilling line. Field units report 70% signal loss during armored movement. The phrase signal loss became an obsession for the United States Army. Throughout the 1930s, the military had remained loyal to the amplitude modulation, AM, radio system, a technology once hailed as a marvel of the interwar period. But by the early years of World War II, as tanks moved across dusty fields with engines roaring, AM waves suffered such severe interference that officers had to shout over the noise of the machines to give commands. According to the Army Ordnance Technical Report of 1941, signal instability exceeded 70%, and the effective communication range dropped below 2 miles. In modern warfare, that meant blindness. Military engineers understood that the problem was not tactical, but physical in nature. AM waves amplified both signal and noise, turning every electrical spark, engine explosion, or magnetic field into an enemy. While Germany and Britain focused on improving armor, artillery, and engines, the Americans quietly investigated a lesser-known field: frequency communication. At the Signal Corps laboratories, a group of young engineers was assigned to redefine the very concept of communication reliability. They did not know that their work in that small laboratory would change the way wars were fought. On July 22, 1941, the Army officially standardized 3 new radio lines: SCR-508, SCR-528, and SCR-538. The document, signed by Chief Signal Officer Lieutenant General Dawson Olmsted, noted, "All medium tanks to be equipped with standard FM sets." The letters FM, frequency modulation, marked one of the most revolutionary decisions of World War II. There was no ceremony, no grand announcement, just a technical directive filed in the archives. Yet that day became the birth of what historians would later call the Silent War Project. In the rooms filled with wires and the smell of solder at Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, headquartered in Chicago, 2 young engineers were turning that directive into reality. Daniel E. Noble, an electronics lecturer at the University of Connecticut and the first to propose applying FM to tanks, was invited to serve as technical advisor for Galvin. He carried with him the belief that, if a radio channel can eliminate noise, it can save lives. Alongside him was Henryk Magnuski, a Polish-born engineer and expert in high-frequency transmission, who had worked at the Warsaw Radio Laboratory before the war began. In their hands lay the foundational work of Edwin Howard Armstrong, the inventor of FM, long ignored by commercial radio corporations for a decade. In the laboratory journal preserved in the Motorola archives, dated September 3, 1941, Magnuski wrote, "Problem: maintain frequency stability under vibration and temperature change." On the workbench sat the early models of the BC-604 transmitter and BC-603 receiver, weighing nearly 200 pounds. They had to reduce the weight to 181 pounds, light enough to fit inside a tank without damaging its electrical system. During the first trial, the engine's vibration caused the oscillating circuit to drift in frequency. Noble adjusted it, replacing the capacitor with a crystal-controlled oscillator, and the results exceeded all expectations. Stability reached plus or minus 0.01%, an error so small that the signal remained steady even as the tank climbed hills or crossed mud. According to the Signal Corps report, the BC-604 transmitter output reached 25 watts, 2.5 times stronger than the German FuG-5 radio. In simulated battlefield conditions in the Arizona desert, the practical communication range reached 10 to 15 miles, and even under heavy interference, FM waves retained almost perfect clarity. One test officer wrote, "It cuts through engine noise like a knife through paper." From that simple remark, the concept of voice clarity superiority was recorded in the Technical Standardization Document of 1942. In Washington, Army officers remained skeptical. They argued that tanks needed only to use flags and hand signals. But the engineers knew that warfare was entering a mechanized era, where information moved faster than bullets. Noble persisted in presenting before the military board in December 1941, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He said, An armored corps is blind without sound. According to the meeting transcript, the old general in charge of logistics paused for several seconds, then replied, "Then give them ears." The decision was approved. From that moment, every M4 Sherman tank rolling off the Detroit assembly line carried an electronic heart, the SCR-508 radio set. In the testing room, green light reflected off the metal surface of the new device. Magnuski adjusted the frequency knob and pressed his ear to the headphones. From the speaker came a voice so clear it sounded almost unreal against the background of engine noise. He looked up and smiled faintly. "It works," he said. In the corner, Noble wrote in his notebook, "Stability achieved, clarity above expectation." That was the moment when war, though not yet fought by them, had already begun to change. By early 1942, when America formally entered the war, Motorola was commissioned to begin mass production. According to the company's internal report, within just 8 months, the production line had turned out more than 3,800 SCR-508 units, far exceeding expectations. Each unit contained 2,748 components, 470, 4 capacitors, 385 resistors, and a high-power electrical filtering system to block engine interference. The Chicago assembly line operated 24 hours a day, with workers rotating in shifts. Young women who once built civilian radios were now soldering circuits for war machines. Outside, crates labeled U.S. Army Signal Corps, Chicago, Illinois, awaited shipment to the port. According to the Army Signal Corps Report, Volume 4, 1942, the standardization of FM radio had transformed every medium tank into a mobile command post, a statement that sounded technical but carried deep meaning. Tanks were no longer isolated combat units, but part of a larger network. This was the first step toward what would become the concept of the networked battlefield, more than half a century before it became the foundation of modern digital warfare. Daniel Noble once wrote in a 1942 note, "War belongs to those who understand transmission, not destruction." It was not a slogan, but the conviction of a generation of engineers who believed that victory lay in connection, not explosion. When the first FM radio waves crossed the test desert and reached the ears of a Sherman operator, they were not just hearing each other's voices, they were hearing the future of war. In a post-war interview, Magnuski recalled that moment. When the line cleared, he said, "We realized we had built something greater than a radio. We built understanding." Out there, bullets had yet to be fired, but in that small Chicago laboratory, the engineers' war had begun silent, precise, and irreversible. And in that silence, history changed frequency. In the mid-1930 seconds, when Berlin hosted a defense industry exhibition, Telefunken's booth drew the attention of every foreign military delegation. The FuG-5 radio system, sophisticated and compact, was introduced as the ears of Blitzkrieg. Germany took pride in the fact that its Panzers could move at unprecedented speed, thanks to the ability to communicate directly between command and lead tanks. Their amplitude modulation, AM, technology was then considered the world's standard. Yet refinement carried within it a fatal limitation: fragility. As the war expanded and industrial production reached its breaking point, Telefunken could not simultaneously scale both quality and quantity. Across the Atlantic, however, Motorola, a rising company from Chicago, chose a different path. It did not pursue the absolute perfection of a single product, but aimed for repeatable mass production with consistent reliability. FM, a technology many European engineers at the time dismissed as useless on the battlefield, was adopted by the United States as its foundation. That mindset reflected two opposing philosophies. The Germans believed in craftsmanship, the Americans believed in systems. And in war, systems endure longer than hands. According to the Signal Corps Technical Review of 1942, Germany's FuG-5 radio had a transmitting power of 10 watts and an operating frequency range of 27.0 to 33.3 MHz, using amplitude modulation. While on the move, its effective communication range was only 500 to 1,000 meters, a reduction of more than 70% compared to stationary conditions. More importantly, the Panzer Division's organizational structure dictated that only 1 or 2 vehicles in each platoon could transmit two-way signals, while the rest were equipped only with FuG-2 receivers. They could receive orders but could not respond. In combat, a single shell hitting the command tank meant the entire platoon lost its voice. According to the Oberkommando des Heeres report of 1943, more than 80% of German tanks in the Kursk campaign could receive orders but not transmit battlefield conditions. It was tactical silence. Telefunken tried to solve this by increasing power output and improving antennas, but the FuG-5 circuitry depended on the tank's unstable power source. Every spark from the engine or track collision caused signal interference. During extended battles, backup batteries were quickly depleted, filters burned out, and frequency adjustment had to be done manually with variable capacitors, often drifting after only a few hours of operation. A technical report from August 1943 noted that only 58% of the radio units still functioned reliably after 48 hours of continuous marching. Meanwhile, Motorola entered the war with a completely different philosophy. Engineered simplicity. Each SCR-508 set was designed so that semi-skilled workers could assemble it while keeping component tolerance within plus or minus 1%. The use of crystal-controlled frequency virtually eliminated frequency drift, the chronic disease of AM radios. According to the U.S. Army production record of 1944, the defect rate on Motorola's assembly lines was less than 0.3%, a figure European factories of the time considered impossible. By the end of that year, more than 50,000 SCR-508 units had been delivered to the Army, enough to equip all 49,324 Sherman tanks produced during the entire war. Each Sherman, therefore, was not just a combat vehicle but a node in the first global communication network. By 1943, Germany's production crisis had become severe. Although the Nibelungen and MAN factories had produced more than 5,700 medium tanks, Telefunken supplied fewer than 2,000 FuG-5 transceivers. Most remaining vehicles had to use outdated radios or none at all. Reports from the Eastern Front noted that many Panzer units had to rely on signal flares, flags, or even motorcycle couriers to transmit orders methods of the 1910s. While German engineers wrestled with circuit boards and vacuum tubes, American engineers had already shifted to modular production, assembling by unit blocks and performing automated testing with wave meters. Telefunken's absolute quality philosophy meant each radio required 40 hours of manual tuning, while at Motorola, this process took only 3 hours, largely thanks to standardized components. The mindset of production over perfection gave the United States overwhelming superiority in a field where it had once been considered slower than Germany: electronic warfare. According to the German Army Communications Directorate, by the end of 1944, Germany's entire armoured force maintained only 20% of its two-way communication capability. Panzer officers frequently reported command isolation during counterattacks. One German officer wrote in his Normandy diary, "Every time the command tank is hit, we become blind ghosts among the smoke." In contrast, the U.S. Army Ordnance Report of December 1944 described the opposite scene. Communication is constant. Tank crews from different battalions exchange coordinates without delay. A field artillery coordinator from the 2nd Corps wrote, "It feels less like radio and more like telepathy." By this point, the technological gap was no longer measured in megahertz but in organizational capacity. If Telefunken symbolized German engineering thought precision to the point of obsession, then Motorola represented American industrial thinking organization to the point of perfection. One side built radios like crafting watches, the other built them like printing newspapers. Both believed they were right, but the battlefield chose the side that could replicate its correctness. As the war entered its 3rd year, Daniel Noble and Henrik Magnuski received a detailed intelligence report on German radio performance. After reading it, Noble simply nodded. "Their problem isn't physics," he said. "It's philosophy." He understood that Telefunken did not fail from a lack of skill, but from its disbelief in uniformity, a seemingly small principle that was the soul of industrial mass production. In the world of modern warfare, whoever controls frequency controls information, and whoever controls information controls the outcome. By the end of 1944, Germany still clung to AM, the language of the past, while the United States was already speaking FM, the language of the future. That difference did not arise from cannons, but from copper coils and quartz crystals on the desks of nameless engineers. Telefunken believed perfection brought victory. Motorola believed repetition sustained victory. One side created, the other organized. And in the fading static of 1944's frequencies, one could hear the boundary between two industries pulling apart forever. On November 8, 1942, desert winds blew blinding sand across the landing zones near Safi and Fedala. Under a pale golden dawn, the first M4 Sherman tanks of the 2nd Armored Division rolled off the landing ships, their steel tracks grinding over the wet sand. For the first time in history, tanks were equipped with the SCR-508 radio system, using frequency modulation technology that engineers in Chicago had tested in the laboratory only a year before. Operation Torch was not merely the first American landing in North Africa, it was also the first trial by fire for FM under live combat. According to the after-action report, 2nd Armored Division, November 1942, all 162 Sherman tanks engaged in battle were equipped with the new FM radios. Signal Corps engineers were dispatched alongside the troops to record real-world data, frequency stability, interference resistance, and operational range. On the Tunisian plains, as German artillery shelled the American formations, the signals between units remained so clear that veteran officers were astonished. A recording preserved in the U.S. Army Signal Archives still carries the dry voice transmitted over FM, Alpha 2 to Bravo 4, flank them at 80 degrees, confirmed. Amidst the roar of engines and gunfire, that sound pulsed like a steady heartbeat through the formation. The first major clash between American and German forces took place at Kasserine Pass from February 14th to 24th, 1943. The terrain there was treacherous mountain ridges and deep ravines split the lines, turning direct engagement into a nightmare for all sides. Yet in this seemingly hopeless environment, FM revealed its strength. 5 Sherman tanks of Company C, 1st Armored Regiment, separated by more than 40 miles, were still able to coordinate maneuvers, intercept attacks, and counterstrike with minute-level precision. According to the U.S. Army Communications Summary, the effective communication range reached nearly 50 miles, far beyond any limit previously achieved by AM systems. A German lieutenant from the 10th Panzer Division wrote in his diary on February 18th, "The enemy moves as one body, even when scattered beyond sight." German officers could not understand how the American formations synchronized without flares or couriers. A report by the Panzer Lehr Division after the battle stated plainly, "American signals are as clear as in a room, while we hear only white noise." In the valleys of Kasserine, where every electric spark from a Panzer engine turned into a storm of frequencies, German FuG-5 radios transmitted only a few hundred meters before signals drowned in interference. The American FM cut through it like a blade through wet cloth. According to the German Army Communications Directorate, the difference lay not only in technology but in philosophy. Germany concentrated radio units in command tanks, while the United States distributed them across the entire formation. When one Sherman was destroyed, the next instantly assumed command, keeping the flow of communication unbroken. For the first time in warfare, an armored unit operated as a true network, where every component could both transmit and receive. In a film reel preserved at the National Archives, the dust of Tunisia clouds the lens. A Signal Corps engineer, his uniform still covered in sand, adjusts the antenna atop a turret. He turns to his colleague and laughs. "It works even in hell." The caption beneath reads, "Field Test, SCR-508, Kasserine Sector, February 1943. None of them knew that this test would enter history as the first demonstration of FM in modern warfare. In the rear, Daniel E. Noble received field reports through encrypted telegrams. In his Motorola office in Chicago, he stood by the window reading each line. Field clarity, excellent. Coordination, maintained across terrain. FM proves stable under fire. He simply smiled and said to his colleague, "The theory has survived the desert." It was not just the success of an invention, but a turning point in military thought. War was no longer guided by sight, but by signal. According to the U.S. Army Evaluation Memo of 1943, during the Tunisian campaign, American units maintained internal communication for 90% of the marching time, while German forces dropped to 35%. Tactical analysts noted, "Coordination persists, even when visual contact is lost." The numbers were cold, yet they meant survival. In darkness or sandstorms, hearing a comrade's voice was the difference between life and death. For the engineers, it was a triumph of principle. FM did not merely suppress noise, it created what they called reliability under chaos. The stable frequencies vibrating across the barren desert were proof that physics had overcome terrain. As Henryk Magnuski later said after the war, FM doesn't fight the noise, it ignores it. That very indifference had saved hundreds of lives in the first clashes. When the campaign ended, although Kasserine Pass was a tactical defeat for the Americans, the Signal Corps' final report declared it a complete technical victory. FM was credited as the single factor preventing total disintegration of the armoured formations. One commander wrote in his log, "The tanks spoke even when the men couldn't." In Berlin, Telefunken engineers were ordered to analyse the causes of failure. A classified report dated March 12, 1943, concluded, "Enemy uses unknown modulation, eliminating interference. Recommend further research." But that research was never completed. By the time Germany realized it was facing a type of signal it could not capture, the battlefield had already entered another era. Daniel Noble called it the moment of proof. In his address at the Signal Corps Symposium in 1945, he recalled, "In the desert, we proved that silence is a weapon. The less you shout, the more you control." Those words echoed through the softly lit hall, where young engineers listened as if attending a memorial for a technological age that had saved the lives of soldiers they would never meet. Kasserine Pass was not only the first battle between America and Germany, it was where laboratory theory became the doctrine of war. From that moment on, victory no longer belonged to those who could see the enemy, but to those who could hear more clearly. And in that silence, the first networked army was born. In the autumn of 1943, as the fighting in Italy entered its fiercest stage, the Apennine Hills became a natural test for every communication system. The rocky terrain, deep valleys, and high humidity caused radio signals to reflect, distort, and often vanish within short distances. According to the Signal Corps Operational Review of 1944, 70% of AM signals were lost in environments with two or more reflective surfaces, but with FM waves, this effect was nearly eliminated. Sherman tanks equipped with SCR-508 radios maintained contact across valleys, while Germany's FuG-5 fell silent after only a few minutes of movement. The 1st Armoured Division report stated, FM transmission remained stable through terrain where AM was unusable. For the first time, technology not only resisted man-made interference but also overcame nature itself. At the front line near Cassino, field engineers set up a makeshift test station. They stretched wires from the hilltop down to the infantry's position, measuring signal strength every hour, meticulously recording changes in temperature and humidity. In a documentary preserved by the Army Pictorial Service, the glow of an oil lamp illuminated dust-covered faces, hands still clutching headsets amid the sound of artillery. A young engineer murmured, "FM breathes better than men do here." What seemed like a joke, in fact, captured the essence of the new technology, flexible, adaptive, and resilient. When the Italian campaign ended, FM technology had proven its value beyond expectation. But farther north, another problem awaited. On June 6, 1944, in Normandy, American divisions launched the largest amphibious landing in history. As Sherman tanks rolled up the sandy shores and infantry followed behind, they discovered a disastrous truth. The two branches spoke different frequency languages. Tank radios operated in the 20 to 27.9 MHz range, while the infantry used SCR-300 units in the 40 to 48 MHz range. There was no way for the two sides to hear each other. According to the U.S. Army Communications Log, Omaha Sector, dozens of losses occurred because infantry could not warn tanks of Panzerfaust gunners ambushing just off the road. The situation became so critical that the High Command convened the frontline engineering group of Operation Cobra, the breakthrough campaign following Normandy. In a tent filled with diagrams and coils of wire, they debated a temporary but immediately effective solution. On July 12, 1944, an engineer named Harold B. Arnold, formerly of Motorola, proposed, "If frequencies can't meet in the air, connect them with copper." The idea was so simple it seemed absurd. Within 2 days, the engineering team built a device using an EE-8 field telephone placed in an empty ammunition box, directly wired into the tank's intercom system. When the tank stopped, the infantry could lift the handset and speak directly to the crew. According to the field test report dated July 25, 1944, the device worked perfectly on the first try. A film captured the test. A sweat-drenched soldier tapped lightly on the side of a Sherman, headset pressed to his ear. A voice came through. "You're clear to move." He nodded, pointing toward the field ahead. Inside the tank, the gunner replied with the flick of a switch, and the engine roared. That coordination, taking only seconds, saved hundreds of lives in the following battles. According to the 9th Army Ordnance Summary, thanks to the EE-8 device, artillery coordination time dropped to 3 to 5 minutes, while the Germans still required 15 to 30 minutes to transmit orders through multiple command layers. American communication efficiency was 6 times that of the enemy. By the end of 1944, FM had become the backbone of the entire combat system. Every tank, platoon, and artillery post was linked within a single network. At the headquarters, European Theatre of Operations, analysts began calling it the battlefield network, a term never before used in military vocabulary. Reports described a new command model where orders flowed in multiple directions simultaneously instead of moving one way from top to bottom. According to the ETO Command Review, tactical reaction speed increased 300% compared to the North Africa campaign. On a battlefield where every second determined survival, that difference was revolutionary. From Chicago, Daniel E. Noble sent a telegram congratulating the engineering team in Europe. "You turned invention into system." It was a simple acknowledgement, yet it carried historical weight. He understood that the war had moved beyond the confines of laboratories. It was now being continued by anonymous soldier engineers, those who soldered wires amid bombs and tuned circuits under gunfire. Later that year, at a forward base near Nancy, a young engineer placed his hand on the hull of a tank newly fitted with an EE-8 telephone, and heard a clear voice echo through the copper line. He looked at his comrades and smiled. Now they can talk. The words were drowned by the sound of the engine, but their meaning carried farther than any gunshot. In 2 years, FM had journeyed from blueprint to battlefield, from the Apennine Range to the beaches of Normandy, from isolated signals to an integrated network. And within that network, for the first time in the history of warfare, humans and machines spoke the same language. In September 1944, the Lorraine region of France was shrouded in fog and mud. The fields around Aracourt, small on the map, became the focal point of a confrontation between two philosophies of war: German mechanical firepower versus American information organization. Over 17 days of combat, from September 18th to October 4th, the United States 4th Armored Division faced 3 Panzer brigades equipped with the Panther and Tiger tanks that German military circles considered invincible. In terms of armor, firepower, and range, the Sherman was inferior in every measure. But at Aracourt, victory came not from steel but from radio signals. According to the after-action report of the 4th Armored Division, the weather during the battle blinded every eye. The fog was so thick that visibility dropped below 300 meters, grounding air support and blinding artillery observers. In those conditions, the Panzer units lost coordination, while the Shermans linked through the SCR-508 system began to operate like a nervous network. Each tank was a data node, capable of issuing commands, receiving coordinates, warning of threats, and synchronizing fire instantly. It was the first time in history that an armored force operated on the principle of a peer-to-peer information network instead of a linear chain of command. According to the report from the 9th Army Signal Section, each Sherman platoon was divided into groups of 3 to 5 tanks. Frequencies were assigned by sector, command channel, and tactical channel, ensuring that every unit retained initiative. When one tank spotted the enemy, the signal was transmitted instantly to the entire cluster, in a recording preserved at the U.S. Army Archives. The voice of a Sherman crewman rings short and sharp. Contact, grid 1427, 2 Panthers moving east. 15 seconds later, another tank replied, copy. Adjusting sight. Firing now. The 75mm cannon cracked dryly. Within 1 minute, the target vanished from the map. On the other side, German tanks operated under a centralized model. Every order came from a command vehicle. A single artillery shell hitting the command turret silenced the entire formation. The report from Panzer Brigade 111, sent to the Wehrmacht General Staff on September 23, stated plainly, radio failure and fog conditions resulted in complete disorganization. The phrase complete disorganization was the death sentence for a tactical mindset built on one-way command. Meanwhile, the Shermans functioned as a closed electronic network, where each element possessed computing authority. When visibility collapsed and radar or air reconnaissance could no longer assist, signal became the only remaining sense. According to the Combat Communications Summary of 1944, the average radio exchange rate reached 120 messages per hour between battalions. Each message contained an order, coordinates, and target confirmation, written by hand and encoded with a simple time and grid method. This continuous flow of information allowed American units to react 10 to 15 minutes faster than the Germans in every engagement. That brief span of time was enough to decide an entire battle. On September 22nd, 7 Sherman tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion were ambushed by 14 Panthers. Through FM linkage, they called in artillery support in just 4 minutes and 30 seconds, accurate enough for the shells to strike the Panther convergence point before the American tanks took any losses. Captain Creighton Abrams, then battalion commander, wrote in his diary, "We fought blind, but we heard everything." A simple sentence, yet it captured the essence of victory. According to the final assessment by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, the Battle of Aracourt ended with staggering results. 280, 1 German tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed. Against 41, Shermans lost a ratio of 7 to 1. Witnesses described the battlefield afterward as a graveyard of machinery. German officers could not understand how an opponent weaker in firepower could achieve such absolute dominance. They blamed the weather, reconnaissance, and artillery support, but never suspected that the reason lay in a 25-watt radio wave. In a classified report from the German Army Communications Directorate to the Ministry of Defense in October 1944, a single line read, "Enemy coordination is abnormally high. We assume prearranged codes or superior discipline." The Germans believed American success came from training, not realizing that every American tank could transmit, receive, and coordinate simultaneously. They still fought within the framework Guderian had drawn a decade earlier, where the command tank was the sole brain. But at Aracourt, the Americans had gone further. They had built a multi-neural army with no single brain, hundreds of minds thinking together on the same frequency. According to Signal Corps analysis No. 312, the radio system of the 4th Armoured Division maintained 96% operational stability throughout the campaign, despite harsh weather and intense combat. Frequency synchronization was ensured by quartz crystal oscillators, keeping deviation within plus or minus 0.01%. This allowed tanks from different units to link without recalibration. Engineer Henrik Magnuski, overseeing Motorola's production line, wrote in a letter to Noble, They're fighting with circuits we drew on paper. A simple line, yet one that held an astonishing truth. The war was being conducted as a living electrical schematic. From the outcome at Aracourt, the U.S. General Staff drew a doctrinal lesson. In November 1944, the report titled Combat Command Organization was issued. Its central principle: combat organization must be based on communication capability, not rank hierarchy. Units were allowed to merge, separate, and restructure in real time. The report stated, flexibility is no longer tactical, it is electrical. It was the first military doctrine in history founded on technology rather than battlefield experience. During the final briefing at the headquarters of the European Theatre of Operations, generals presented the radio linkage chart of the 4th Armoured Division. Arrows connected platoons, battalions, and artillery units into a complex circuitry-like pattern. As the room lights dimmed, an old general whispered, "They fought like a network, not an army." Aracourt was not merely a tactical victory, it was proof that organization could defeat machinery. The power of steel, cannon, and speed had reached its limit, while the power of organization and information was only beginning. Daniel E. Noble wrote in his 1945 notes, "We gave them radios, they built a system." The engineers of Motorola had achieved what strategists had only dreamed of, turning every tank into a node and the entire battlefield into a thinking network. On the rain-soaked plains of Lorraine, the blackened frames of Panther tanks lay shrouded in mist. Amid that scene, an American officer knelt beside the charred radio of a destroyed Sherman, flipped the switch, and saw the signal light still glowing, emitting a faint, steady hum. He smiled. "Still transmitting," he said. That simple remark was, in truth, the perfect summary of a new era's essence. At Aracourt, technology replaced instinct. The organization defeated machinery, and in the silence of the FM waves, war shifted to another frequency. In March of 1945, the Rhineland was cold and damp. Thick fog clung to the Rhine River like a grey veil that hid the opposite bank. As the sun rose, the vanguard units of the 9th Armoured Division advanced toward the town of Remagen. They expected an empty riverbank, the bridges blown apart like every other one along the German defensive line. But when the lead reconnaissance convoy rounded the bend, what appeared before them made them hold their breath. The Ludendorff Bridge, a massive steel structure spanning the river, was still intact. According to the after-action report, 9th Armoured Division, March 1945, that information was transmitted to Corps headquarters within 2 minutes and 13 seconds. From a mobile SCR-508 transmitter mounted on a jeep, the FM signal was sent directly to the frequency of the 1st Army Command. There, the signal operator recorded every word. "Bridge intact. Repeat, bridge intact." According to the U.S. Army Operations Log, within less than 1 hour, the entire front line, stretching hundreds of miles, had adjusted its axis of attack. Infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery units redirected toward Remagen, initiating the most unexpected river crossing of the Second World War. This speed of response was something German strategists could never have imagined. Previously, identifying a strategic target, sending the message, confirming it, and redeploying forces typically required 6 to 8 hours. But at Remagen, the synchronized FM radio network turned the entire force into a single organism. Signals moved faster than any convoy of reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Germans, still dependent on fixed telephone lines, and AM transmitters were cut off in fragments by bombing raids. According to the German Army Communications Directorate, primary cable lines were destroyed by P-47 airstrikes within the first 2 days of March, leaving the German forces completely blind in communication. At the scene, smoke and dust from bomb blasts had not yet settled. Captain Karl Timmermann, commander of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, ordered his tanks to drive straight onto the bridge. He spoke through the radio. "All units, move across before they blow it." That signal, just 3 short words, saved the entire operation. Had it been 5 minutes later, the Ludendorff Bridge might have been demolished. By 1600 hours that same day, More than 8,000 American troops had crossed the river successfully. The First Army Headquarters report noted, "Rapid coordination achieved via FM network. Enemy unprepared." In a temporary command post in Bonn, German officers were in chaos. They refused to believe the initial report that the Americans had seized the bridge. A lieutenant colonel in charge of communications wrote in his diary, "Telephone lines cut, FuG-5 barely reaches command tanks, messages delayed or lost. When the counterattack order was transmitted over AM frequencies, the signal was distorted and jammed, taking nearly 40 minutes to reach the units at the bridgehead. In that time, the Americans had already installed anti-aircraft guns, secured the bridge, and established a defensive perimeter. The speed of the signal had surpassed the speed of the command. According to the Signal Corps Evaluation Report, 1945, the FM system during the Remagen operation functioned at 98% reliability, despite rain, fog, and electromagnetic interference from hundreds of engines. Motorola field engineer Henry Halper recorded in his notes, "Field transmission remained coherent, even under artillery vibration." For them, this was no longer an experiment but proof of FM's absolute superiority, a weapon invisible yet indestructible by artillery fire. Just 1 month later, as the Rhineland campaign concluded, the war entered its final phase. In April 1945, American armies surrounded the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland. More than 325,000 Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe troops were trapped between the Rhine and the Lippe rivers. From above, P-38 reconnaissance squadrons photographed black columns of smoke rising from burning factories. On the ground, German radios went silent. According to the US 12th Army Group Intelligence Report, within 48 hours, German communications collapsed completely, all major command lines intercepted or destroyed. The collapse was quiet. When telephone networks were severed, German units switched to radio, but the FuG-5 transmitters were weak and relied on depleted batteries. Interference from engines, sparks, and artillery caused the signal to vanish after a few hundred meters. A captured German officer confessed during interrogation, "We heard nothing from the division for 2 days. We fought as if in fog." Meanwhile, the Americans conducted operations like a real-time control system. Regiments coordinated attacks via FM signals linking artillery, air support, and armor. According to the U.S. Army Ordnance Comparative Study, the average American counter-battery response time was only 3 to 5 minutes from the moment reconnaissance reported coordinates to the detonation on target. The Germans, with fragmented command lines, required 15 to 30 minutes for the same process. Every hour, American units exchanged more than 200 radio messages, while German units transmitted fewer than 30. 80% of Panzer tanks were recorded as unable to request support due to radio failure. Those figures were not merely statistics, but evidence of the end of a military model built on centralized command. On April 18, 1945, the Ruhr pocket completely collapsed. The entire German force in the region, over 300,000 soldiers, surrendered. The ETO command summary recorded tersely, "Communications paralysis preceded physical collapse." In other words, the Wehrmacht died from loss of voice before it died from loss of ammunition. In Chicago, at the Motorola factory, Daniel E. Noble received the final report from the Signal Corps. He read each line slowly. FM network maintained coordination across the entire theater, even under heavy interference. He did not smile. He simply placed his hand on the circuit diagram hanging on the wall. "The engineers won the war before the generals did," he quietly told Magnuski when they met again later. That remark was noted in Magnuski's diary under a single line: "Speed of signal beats speed of command." From Remagen to Ruhr, radio had replaced artillery. With every press of a transmit button, another unit moved, a gun battery shifted aim, and a bridge was saved. The FM wave 25 watts, 27 megahertz had become the new energy of war. It swept across the Rhine, raced along German highways, and coursed through every vehicle, every headset, every command. When the war ended, Signal Corps engineers compiled all data into the final technical report, 1945. A single line in the conclusion read, "The FM communication system proved decisive in determining operational tempo." The phrase operational tempo appeared for the first time as a strategic concept. From that point on, warfare would no longer be measured by the number of tanks, but by the speed of information. The morning after Germany's surrender, in a small room at Motorola headquarters, the early light filtered through a dust-covered window. Noble stood silently before a map of Europe marked with red dots representing active frequencies. All of them still glowed. He whispered to himself, "We built a system that talks faster than men can think." Outside, the sound of a train whistle mingled with the April wind. And somewhere across the 27 MHz band, the final signals of the war still echoed steady, precise, immortal. In 1946, as the smoke of war faded, the U.S. Department of Defense released Technical Intelligence Report number 176. The first line read, "German tank communications equipment was 5 years behind American systems." That conclusion closed. A war fought not only on the ground but across the invisible spectrum. While historians argued about firepower, armor, and tactics, the silent engineers in the rear understood that the 20th century had established a new rule. Information travels faster than orders, and orders travel faster than bullets. After the war, the U.S. Army declassified much of the Signal Corps archives, turning the FM research program's findings into open scientific assets. From the diagrams of the SCR-508, Soviet engineers developing the T-54 tank communication system recreated a similar design, naming it the R-113, operating in the 20 to 22 MHz range with 20 watts of power. According to the Soviet Armored Forces Technical Journal in 1950, this system was inspired by American equipment recovered in Europe in 1945. Though they stood opposed during the Cold War, both superpowers built upon the same principle: the radio network as the central nervous system of modern warfare. That same year in West Germany, a nation rebuilding its industry began to relearn the lesson it had once ignored. The Bundeswehr, founded in 1955, included in the Leopard 1 tank training manual a line regarded as a declaration of a new era: communication over firepower. For a new generation of German officers, war was no longer a lesson in mechanical strength but in coordination. A training report from the Münster Armoured Schools stated, "A Leopard without a radio is a blind tank, and blindness means defeat." In the United States, the engineers who had worked on the FM program moved into aviation and space technology. Daniel E. Noble became Motorola's director of research, while Henrik Magnuski continued developing microwave networks for transcontinental communications. Building upon the foundation of the SCR-508, they produced the prototypes for satellite and civilian radio systems. In a 1957 speech to students at MIT, Noble said, "We learned in war that networks win. Everything else just follows." 12 years later, when ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet, was created, many of its frequency coordination and node management principles were taken directly from Signal Corps documents written during World War II. The concept of network-centric warfare was formally defined in the early 1990s, but its roots lay in the hand-drawn FM schematics of 1941. When Operation Desert Storm began in 1991, the U.S. digital communication system operated on the same philosophy as the SCR-508. Each unit was an independent node, able to share data, coordinate automatically, and make real-time decisions based on live information. According to the U.S. Army Signal Command Review of 1992, more than 90% of units in the campaign maintained parallel communication without fixed command centers, a perfect reenactment of the model Noble and Magnuski had designed in 1944. When asked after the war about the greatest turning point in his career, Edwin Armstrong, the father of FM, replied, "It was when soldiers stopped shouting and started listening." The sentence, simple yet sharp, captured the essence of an entire century. Modern warfare no longer belonged to explosions, but to those who could listen best. Years later, at the NATO Communications School in Belgium, a replica of the SCR-508 radio was placed in a glass case beside a brass plaque reading, "From this box, the modern battlefield was born." Each year, new cadets were asked to listen to the first recorded FM transmission at Kasserine Pass, the faint voice amid engine noise, still clear after 8 decades. Alpha 2 to Bravo 4, flank them at 80 degrees. That voice has endured 80 years, retaining the same clarity the engineers once promised. According to the NATO Engineering Archive of 1970, more than 40% of the Alliance's early tactical communication training materials were based on Motorola and Signal Corps models. Every page carried the same principle: every soldier is a node, every node must talk. That philosophy spread beyond the military, influencing management, aviation, medicine, and telecommunications. From a small laboratory in Chicago, the engineers' war had reached outward to shape the entire civilian world. In a recollection recorded at a 1950 conference in Berlin, Wilhelm Keitel, former German field marshal, spoke in a low, somber tone. "We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together." The words echoed through the crowded room, beneath dim yellow light and the scratching of pens on paper. Some said he spoke in justification. Others believed it was a confession. Either way, it became the summation of a century in which coordination triumphed over perfection. The War of the Engineers ended, but their legacy never ceased. From the resistors and quartz crystals within the SCR-508, the world advanced into the age of satellites, data, and artificial intelligence. Every transmitted signal, every packet of data traveling across global servers carries a trace of the revolution of 1941, when ordinary people in a laboratory believed that information, properly connected, could save the world. In the upper halls of the Smithsonian Museum, the SCR-508 rests beneath white light, beside a small plaque that reads, "The signal that won a war." Outside, a speaker plays the voice of Daniel E. Noble. "We built connections, not weapons." Then silence. A special kind of silence, the silence of a frequency that has completed its mission.